Commander Zethkar gazed at the blue marble suspended in the void through the observation deck of the dreadnought Void's embrace. Earth looked so small, so insignificant, yet this tiny world had become the source of the Galactic Confederation's greatest concern. "Status report," Zethkar commanded, his four arms clasped behind his chitinous back. "All fleet positions confirmed, Commander," replied his aide, Lieutenant Vrexta. 200 vessels in high orbit, planetary bombardment arrays charged and ready. The human population centers have been mapped. We can begin the sterilization process at your command." Zethkar's mandibles clicked in what his species considered satisfaction. The decision had not been made lightly. For 3 cycles, the Galactic Confederation had debated what to do about humanity. These strange bipedal creatures had appeared on the galactic stage with frightening speed, expanding from their single world to 12 colony systems in less than 50 standard years. But it wasn't their expansion that concerned the Confederation. It was their nature. Other species had taken centuries to develop faster-than-light travel. Humans had done it in decades after first achieving spaceflight. Other species formed alliances through careful diplomacy and shared resources. Humans formed them through something they called friendship and an unsettling willingness to die for strangers. Most disturbing of all, humans seemed to view the impossible as merely improbable. During the Battle of Proxima Station, outnumbered 10-1, human defenders had somehow held their position for 6 months against the Croathan raiders. They should have surrendered within days. Instead, they had fought with such desperate creativity that the raiders eventually withdrew, claiming the humans were cursed by the void itself. The Vorthon Empire, known throughout the galaxy for their cold logic and strategic brilliance, had attempted to negotiate trade agreements with human colonies. The negotiations failed not because of human greed or stubbornness, but because humans kept asking questions the Vorthon couldn't answer. Questions like, "Why don't you help species that can't offer you anything in return?" And, "What's the point of existing if you only think about efficiency?" These questions had apparently kept the Vorthon negotiators awake for weeks. The final straw came when human explorers discovered an ancient precursor artifact on a dead world in the Kepler system. Every other species had approached such artifacts with extreme caution, forming committees and research teams that spent years studying them from a safe distance. The humans had simply walked up to it, figured out how to turn it on, and somehow managed to unlock its secrets in 3 days. The artifact revealed star maps showing the locations of dozens of other precursor sites, information that could reshape galactic civilization. The Confederation faced a choice: attempt to control humanity or eliminate them before they became too powerful to stop. They chose elimination. "Commander," Vrexta reported, "long-range sensors detect human vessels approaching from the outer system. Approximately 40 ships, mixed military and civilian." Zethkar's compound eyes narrowed. 40 ships against our fleet of 200? Are they surrendering?" "Negative, sir. They're moving at attack speed and broadcasting on all frequencies. The message is unusual. Play it." The voice that filled the command deck was unmistakably human, carrying an accent from Earth's former United States region. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force. You have violated human space and threatened civilian populations. You have exactly 30 seconds to begin withdrawing from this system, or we will consider your presence an act of war." Silence fell across the alien bridge. Then Zethkar began to laugh, a sound like grinding metal that sent chills through his crew. 40 ships against 200, he wheezed. "They truly are insane. All vessels, prepare for engagement. Show them what happens when primitives challenge their betters." The human fleet spread into what appeared to be a standard battle formation, their ships tiny compared to the massive alien dreadnoughts. The largest human vessel was barely the size of a Confederation frigate. "Beginning bombardment of the human fleet," reported the weapons officer. Plasma batteries charged and—" The officer never finished his sentence. Space around the Confederation fleet suddenly erupted in brilliant flashes of light as dozens of nuclear mines detonated simultaneously. Mines that had somehow been positioned without being detected. "Impossible!" Zethkar roared. "How did they—" "Commander!" the sensor operator screamed. "The human ships are launching fighters, but they're not fighters. They're ramming our vessels." Through the observation windows, Zethkar watched in horror as small human craft accelerated to impossible speeds, their pilots apparently choosing to slam their ships directly into Confederation vessels rather than engage in conventional combat. One of these suicide craft struck the dreadnought Iron Truth, its nuclear payload detonating on impact. The massive alien vessel, built to withstand the combined firepower of entire fleets, cracked in half. "Sir, we're receiving another transmission from the human admiral," Rexta reported, his voice trembling. "This is Chen again," the human voice said, completely calm despite the chaos of battle. "I should mention that the mines were just to get your attention. Our real weapons systems are significantly more interesting. For example, did you know that if you accelerate metallic hydrogen to approximately 15% of light speed, it becomes remarkably effective at penetrating alien shields?" As if summoned by her words, brilliant beams of accelerated matter began lancing through space, punching through Confederation shields as if they were made of paper. Alien dreadnoughts that had dominated battlefields across the galaxy began exploding in sequence. "Retreat!" Zethkar commanded. "All ships retreat immediately." "Sir," his communications officer reported, "Admiral Chen is transmitting again." "Don't bother running," Chen's voice continued with the same terrifying calm. "We've already mapped your hyperspace signatures, but please, do try to escape. It'll give our pursuit squadron some practice." Of the 200 ships in the Confederation fleet, only 12 managed to jump to hyperspace before the human vessels could stop them. And as they fled, each carrying news of the impossible defeat, they brought with them a message Admiral Chen had specifically asked them to deliver. "Tell every species in your Confederation exactly what happened here," her final transmission had said. "Tell them that humanity knows about the vote to exterminate us. Tell them that we're not angry about it. We understand why you're afraid." The message had paused for a moment before continuing. "But tell them this too. You tried to erase us, and instead you've taught us that we're alone in a galaxy full of enemies. That was a mistake. Because now you're going to learn what humans do when they have nothing left to lose." Zethkar stared at the debris field that had once been his fleet. Watching as human ships methodically hunted down escape pods and survivors. They weren't killing the aliens, he realized. They were taking prisoners. That, somehow, was even more terrifying. The human vessels began moving toward Earth's orbital facilities, where emergency broadcasts were already spreading news of the victory across human space. But Zethkar could see something in those transmissions that his species had never encountered before. Humanity wasn't celebrating their victory. They were preparing for war. For the first time in his long military career, Commander Zethkar understood true fear. His species had tried to exterminate a race of creatures that apparently viewed a 200-to-1 disadvantage as merely poor odds rather than certain death. And now those creatures knew that the galaxy considered them a threat worth destroying. As his damaged command ship limped toward the nearest Confederation outpost, Zethkar composed his report. But he knew that no matter how carefully he described what had happened, no one would believe it. Who would believe that a species could turn impossible odds into victory through sheer, incomprehensible determination? Who would believe that creatures so young could fight with such terrifying effectiveness? Most importantly, who would believe his conclusion that humanity had been holding back during their previous encounters, and that the galaxy had just witnessed what humans were truly capable of when they stopped trying to be diplomatic? The report would reach Confederation Command in 6 days. By then, Zethkar suspected, it would already be too late. Behind him, Earth continued to spin peacefully in space, its cities lighting up as night fell across the continents. But now those lights seemed different to the alien commander's eyes. They no longer looked like the glow of civilization. They looked like the eyes of a predator, opening in the dark. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in the observation laboratory aboard Titan Station, watching through reinforced glass as the alien prisoner attempted to communicate with the research team. The creature, which had identified itself as Lieutenant Vrexta of the Galactic Confederation, was unlike anything humanity had previously encountered. "Show me the translation progress," Elena commanded. Her assistant, Dr. James Park, pulled up holographic displays showing linguistic analysis patterns. "We've achieved roughly 60% comprehension. The interesting thing is that their language contains mathematical concepts we haven't discovered yet. They've been sharing stellar coordinates, ship classifications, and what appears to be tactical information about other Confederation species." Elena frowned. "Why would a prisoner volunteer strategic intelligence?" "That's the fascinating part," James replied. "According to our psychological evaluation, he's not trying to betray his own people. He's trying to save them." Through the glass, Vrexta gestured with his multiple appendages at a holographic star map, pointing to various systems while speaking in his harsh, clicking language. The translation software converted his words into text on nearby screens. "You must understand," the text read, "the Confederation is not evil. We are afraid. Your species exhibits patterns that terrify every civilization we have encountered." Dr. Vasquez activated the communication system. "What patterns are you referring to, Lieutenant?" Vrexta's compound eyes focused on her with startling intensity. "Your species weaponizes failure. When other races encounter impossible situations, they surrender or retreat. Humans study the impossible until it becomes merely difficult. Then they study the difficult until it becomes routine." "That's called learning," Elena replied. "No," Vrexta clicked emphatically. "Learning is acquiring information. Your species does something else. You change reality to match your desires rather than accepting that some things cannot be done." James leaned forward. "Can you give us an example?" "The Battle of Proxima Station," Vrexta answered immediately. "The Croathan raiders are masters of siege warfare. They had surrounded your outpost with overwhelming force, cut off all supply lines, and systematically destroyed your defensive capabilities. By every tactical analysis, your defenders should have surrendered within days. But they didn't," Elena observed. "They did worse than not surrender," Vrexta continued, his voice carrying what the translation software indicated was distress. "They began improvising. They turned their life support systems into weapons. They used medical supplies to create explosives. They convinced the station's automated systems to fight alongside them. By the end of the siege, they weren't defending a military outpost anymore." "What were they defending?" "A weapon. The humans had turned the entire station into a single massive bomb, powered by the life force of everyone aboard. The raiders withdrew not because they couldn't win, but because they realized the humans would rather destroy everything than lose." Elena and James exchanged glances. This matched reports they'd received from other human military installations. "Lieutenant," Elena said carefully, "how many species are part of the Galactic Confederation?" 47. "And how many of them supported the decision to eliminate humanity?" Vrexta was quiet for a long moment. 47. The weight of that number settled over the laboratory like a physical presence. Humanity was alone in a galaxy where every other intelligent species had voted for their extinction. "Why?" James asked quietly. "Because you are unpredictable," Vrexta replied. "Every other species follows patterns. The Vorthon prioritize efficiency. The Crothan value strength. The Nexari seek knowledge. We understand their motivations and can predict their actions. But humans? What about humans? You prioritize things that have no logical value. You will die for creatures you have never met. You will sacrifice resources to help species that cannot help you in return. You create art that serves no practical purpose. You explore dangerous regions of space simply because someone should see what's out there. Elena smiled grimly. And that scares you? Terrifies us, Vrexta admitted, because it means we cannot predict what you will do when threatened. We cannot negotiate with you because you might choose to help us instead of helping yourselves. We cannot defeat you because you refuse to lose in comprehensible ways. A soft chime indicated that Admiral Chen was requesting a conference call. Elena accepted the connection, and the Admiral's image appeared on the main screen. Dr. Vasquez, Chen said without preamble, I need your translation team to ask our guest about Confederation military doctrine, specifically their approach to siege warfare and planetary bombardment. Of course, Admiral. Any particular reason? Chen's expression was grim. Long-range sensors have detected a massive fleet buildup in the Arcturus system. Preliminary estimates suggest over 3,000 vessels from multiple Confederation species. They're preparing for a full-scale invasion. Elena felt her blood run cold. How long do we have? 6 weeks, maybe 7. But that's not why I'm calling. Chen paused, looking directly at Vrexta through the camera feed. Lieutenant, I want you to understand something. Your Confederation just made humanity's second worst fear come true. Through the translation system, Vrexta asked, what is humanity's second worst fear? Being alone in a hostile universe, Chen replied. But do you want to know our worst fear? Vrexta's silence was answer enough. Becoming the kind of monsters we'll have to become to survive this, Chen continued. You had a choice, Lieutenant. You could have tried to understand us. Instead, you chose to try to exterminate us. Now, we're going to show you why that was a mistake. The Admiral's image disappeared, leaving Elena and James alone with their alien prisoner. What did she mean? Vrexta asked, his voice carrying undertones that the translation software couldn't interpret. Elena looked at the star charts showing human colony positions, all of which were now under threat from the approaching Confederation armada. She thought about her daughter attending school on New Geneva, about her elderly parents living in the orbital habitats around Earth, about the millions of humans who had no idea that their entire species was about to face extinction. Lieutenant, she said quietly, every human child learns the same lesson in their early education. Would you like to know what it is? Vrexta nodded. We teach them that there are no monsters hiding in the dark, that the things that frighten us in stories aren't real. Elena's voice grew colder. We're about to find out if that was a lie. Over the following days, Elena watched as humanity transformed itself in ways that defied belief. Industrial facilities that had been producing civilian goods suddenly retooled to manufacture weapons of war. Research stations began developing technologies that pushed the boundaries of physics. Most disturbing of all, humans began volunteering for experimental procedures that no other species would even consider. The genetic modification centers reported waiting lists of volunteers eager to undergo procedures that would allow them to survive in hard vacuum or breathe toxic atmospheres. The cybernetic enhancement facilities ran out of components because so many humans wanted to interface directly with their weapon systems. But the most shocking development came from humanity's youngest colonies. New Geneva had been established as a peaceful farming world, home to 3 million civilians, including families with young children. When news of the approaching invasion reached them, Elena expected to hear about evacuation plans. Instead, she received a transmission from the colony governor. Dr. Vasquez, the governor said, we need you to ask your alien friend about something. We've been studying the wreckage from the battle at Earth, and we found some interesting technology in their ships. Specifically, their shield generators seem to operate on frequencies that interact badly with certain organic compounds. What kind of organic compounds? Elena asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. The kind we grow here, the governor replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Turns out that if you modify the genetic structure of certain crops and then process them correctly, you can create a biological agent that dissolves alien shields on contact. We've already begun converting our agricultural facilities. You're turning a farming colony into a weapons manufacturing center? No, the governor corrected. We're turning a farming colony into a weapon, the entire planet. We're going to grow a biological payload in our soil, release it into our atmosphere, and when the Confederation fleet arrives, they're going to discover that our entire world has become toxic to their technology. Elena stared at the transmission in stunned silence. What about your population? We've already begun the genetic modifications necessary to make ourselves immune to the agent. It'll take about 4 weeks to complete the process for everyone on the planet. The children will adapt fastest, of course. They always do. The transmission ended, leaving Elena with the horrifying realization that humanity's response to the threat of extinction was to voluntarily transform themselves into something that could survive it. Dr. Vasquez? Vrexta said quietly, having somehow understood the conversation despite the language barriers. What have we done? Elena looked at him through the reinforced glass, seeing fear in his alien features for the first time since his capture. You tried to make us extinct, she replied. Instead, you've made us evolve. Reports began arriving from other human colonies, each one more disturbing than the last. The mining stations in the asteroid belt had developed techniques for accelerating asteroids to near-light speeds and aiming them at distant targets. The research facilities on Europa had discovered how to turn ice into a form of explosive that was stable until it encountered alien ship hulls. Most terrifying of all, the military academies had begun teaching new courses in what they called xenocide prevention, which appeared to involve strategies for ensuring that hostile alien species could never threaten humanity again. The Confederation believes they are fighting a war, Elena said to Vrexta on his final day in custody before being returned to his people as planned. But you're not, are you? What do you mean? The alien asked. Wars end when one side surrenders or is defeated. But humanity isn't fighting a war. We're fighting for evolution, and evolution doesn't stop until the unsuccessful species becomes extinct. Vrexta's compound eyes fixed on her with desperate intensity. You must tell your leaders that the Confederation is willing to negotiate. We made a mistake. We can coexist. Elena shook her head sadly. I'm afraid it's too late for that, Lieutenant. You see, humans have this saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I don't understand. You had 47 different species vote to exterminate us, even if we somehow trusted you enough to negotiate a peace treaty. What happens in 50 years when another species joins your confederation? What happens in 100 years when your children decide that humanity has grown too powerful? Elena stood to leave, then paused at the laboratory door. We're not angry at you, Lieutenant. We understand that you were afraid. But you've taught us that we can never be safe as long as species like yours exist in our galaxy. Species like ours? Species that choose extermination over coexistence. Species that see difference as threat rather than opportunity. Species that believe might makes right. Elena left Vrexta alone in his cell, staring through the reinforced glass at stars that no longer seemed friendly. Outside, human ships were already departing for distant systems, carrying passengers who no longer looked entirely human, and technologies that no longer seemed entirely possible. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you tried to erase a species that refused to stay erased, and it was going to learn why humanity's greatest strength had always been their ability to become something new when something old was no longer sufficient for survival. Ambassador Kethron of the Vorthan Empire tried to control his trembling as he approached the human diplomatic station orbiting what had once been the Confederation's capital world. The planet below was still habitable, still beautiful, but the massive alien cities that had dominated its surface for millennia were gone, replaced by structures that seemed to grow from the Earth itself. The humans called it urban reforestation. They had somehow convinced the planet's ecosystem to rebuild the cities as living organisms, creating a hybrid of technology and biology that the galaxy's greatest scientists couldn't begin to understand. But the transformed planet wasn't what terrified Kethron. What terrified him was how quickly it had happened. The war had lasted exactly 97 days. The Galactic Confederation's 3,000-ship armada had been designed to overwhelm human defenses through sheer numbers. Instead, they had encountered an enemy that no longer fought according to any recognizable tactical doctrine. Human ships had appeared throughout Confederation space simultaneously, despite the impossibility of such coordination across galactic distances. They hadn't engaged in traditional space battles. Instead, they had somehow convinced entire star systems to turn against the Confederation fleets, literally convinced them. Human diplomats had made contact with the stars themselves. "Ambassador Kethron," a voice said behind him, causing the Vorthan diplomat to spin around in surprise. The being standing in the corridor looked human, mostly. She was tall, graceful, with the kind of symmetrical features that suggested genetic optimization. But her eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire galaxies, and when she moved, space around her seemed to bend slightly. "I am Dr. Elena Vasquez," the human said, extending a hand in the traditional human greeting gesture. "Though I suppose doctor is no longer an accurate title, I've become something more like a planetary consciousness since our conversation with Lieutenant Vrexta." Kethron's translator struggled with several concepts in her statement. "Planetary consciousness? It's complicated," Elena replied with a smile that was somehow both warm and terrifying. "Humanity discovered that consciousness isn't limited to individual minds. When you connect enough neural pathways across sufficient distances, larger patterns of awareness emerge. I am simultaneously Elena Vasquez and the combined intellectual capacity of 14 human colonies." "That's impossible." "Most things are impossible until humans do them," Elena said gently. "Would you like to see the conference room? The other delegates are waiting." Kethron followed her through corridors that seemed to shift and flow like living tissue. The walls displayed what appeared to be windows showing various human colonies, but the Vorthan ambassador realized he was actually looking through the collective sensory apparatus of billions of modified humans. "Dr. Vasquez," he said carefully, "my government sent me here to discuss terms for a ceasefire. We understand that the Confederation made errors in judgment regarding your species." "Oh, the war is already over," Elena replied casually. "We're here to discuss what comes next." They entered a chamber that defied spatial geometry. It seemed vast enough to contain a small moon, yet intimate enough for quiet conversation. Representatives from each of the former Confederation species sat at what appeared to be a single table, despite being separated by distances that should have required shuttlecraft to cross. "Welcome, Ambassador Kethron," said a figure at the center of the table. Kethron recognized Admiral Sarah Chen, though she too had been transformed. Her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, and her presence felt like gravity itself. "Admiral," Kethron said, trying to maintain diplomatic protocols despite his fear. "The Vorthan Empire wishes to formally surrender and requests terms for—" "Ambassador," Chen interrupted gently, "you seem to be under the impression that we conquered you. We didn't. We liberated you." "Liberated us from what?" "From the fear that made you try to commit genocide," Elena answered. "We've studied your species' history, Kethron. The Vorthan Empire wasn't always a cold, calculating civilization focused solely on efficiency. 3,000 years ago, you were explorers, artists, dreamers. What happened? Kethron felt uncomfortable discussing ancient history. My people evolved beyond such inefficiencies. No, Chen said firmly. Your people encountered something that terrified them so badly that they convinced themselves emotion was weakness and wonder was wasteful. You didn't evolve. You traumatized yourselves into becoming machines. A holographic display appeared above the table, showing Vorthon historical records that should have been inaccessible to human technology. The Devourer Wars, Elena said, reading from the ancient files. Your people fought against an enemy that consumed entire civilizations, turning their creativity and passion into fuel for its growth. You defeated it by becoming so cold and logical that you were no longer worth consuming. But in the process, Chen continued, you lost the ability to understand species like humanity. You looked at our emotional responses, our creative solutions, our willingness to sacrifice for abstract concepts, and you saw the devourers. You convinced the entire Confederation that we were a threat because you couldn't distinguish between creativity and consumption. Kethron stared at the records, seeing his species' history laid bare. How do you know this? Because we found the devourers, Elena said simply. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Every delegate at the table turned to stare at her in horror. 3 weeks ago, Chen explained, our deep space exploration vessels detected anomalous energy readings in the void between, the space outside our galaxy. We investigated and discovered a region where entire star systems had been consumed, leaving nothing behind but empty space and strange radiation. The devourers are returning, Elena continued. They've been feeding in other galaxies for the past 50,000 years, growing stronger, learning from each civilization they consume. And they're headed back toward the Milky Way. Kethron felt his species' ancient terror flooding through him. We must flee. We must evacuate the galaxy immediately. No, Chen said calmly. We must fight them. And to fight them, we need allies who remember how to hope, how to dream, how to create something from nothing. But that's impossible, protested another delegate, a spider-like Nexari. The devourers cannot be defeated. They grow stronger with every battle, learning from each tactic used against them. That's true, Elena agreed, which is why we're not going to fight them the same way your ancestors did. The holographic display changed, showing images of human colonies throughout the galaxy. But these weren't the same colonies that had existed before the war. Every human world had been transformed into something that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that had no names. We've been preparing, Chen explained. Humanity has been evolving, not just biologically, but conceptually. We exist now as both individuals and collective consciousness, as both matter and energy, as both creatures of this reality and shapers of new realities. When the devourers arrive, Elena continued, they will find a galaxy that refuses to be consumed. They will encounter civilizations that have learned to create faster than they can destroy, to hope more powerfully than they can despair, to love more deeply than they can hate. A new figure materialized at the table, startling every non-human delegate. It was Lieutenant Vrexta, but transformed beyond recognition. He still possessed his species' basic form, but he glowed with an inner light that suggested vast intelligence. My friends, Vrexta said. Speaking in perfect universal standard without any need for translation, I have experienced what the humans call upgrade. They offered to share their evolutionary advancements with any Confederation species willing to abandon the fear that drove them to attempt genocide. Vrexta, Kethron whispered, what have they done to you? Nothing I did not choose, the transformed alien replied. They showed me what my species could become if we stopped being afraid of our own potential. They offered to help us remember what we were before fear convinced us that survival required surrendering our souls. Chen stood, and her presence seemed to fill the impossible room. Delegates, you came here expecting to surrender to conquerors. Instead, you're being invited to join the greatest alliance in galactic history. An alliance against extinction, Elena added. An alliance of species that choose growth over fear, cooperation over domination, evolution over stagnation. But understand this, Chen continued, her voice carrying absolute authority. This invitation comes with conditions. Any species that joins our alliance must surrender their capacity for genocide. We will help you modify your societies, your psychology if necessary, to ensure that the fear that drove you to try to exterminate us can never again control your decisions. You want to change our fundamental nature, Kethron protested. We want to help you become the best possible versions of yourselves, Elena corrected. The Vorthan Empire can become a civilization of explorers and innovators again. The Croathan raiders can become protectors instead of conquerors. The Nexari can become teachers instead of hoarders of knowledge. And if we refuse? The temperature in the room dropped to near absolute zero, and for a moment, every delegate experienced a vision of what humanity had become when forced to evolve beyond conventional biology. They saw human ships that existed as pure thought moving faster than light itself. They saw human colonies that had convinced entire star systems to serve as weapons. They saw human consciousness that could rewrite the laws of physics through sheer determination. You won't refuse, Chen said quietly as the visions faded. Because you've seen what happens when species refuse to evolve. You become extinct. And extinction is no longer acceptable in our galaxy. The Devourers are coming, Elena added. In approximately 200 years, their advanced scouts will reach our galaxy's edge. We have that long to prepare every species, every world, every individual mind for a war that will determine whether consciousness survives in this universe. We cannot do this alone, Vrexta said, his transformed voice carrying harmonics that spoke directly to the delegates' emotional centers. Humanity is powerful, but the Devourers have consumed 1 trillion civilizations across 1,000 galaxies. We need every possible ally, every unique perspective, every creative solution that any species can provide. But most importantly, Chen concluded, we need civilizations that choose creation over destruction. The old Confederation was built on fear, competition, and the belief that survival required eliminating threats. The new alliance will be built on hope, cooperation, and the belief that survival requires embracing possibilities. Kethron looked around the table at delegates from species that had spent millennia viewing each other as competitors or threats. Now they sat in a chamber created by beings who had somehow transcended the limitations of space and time, discussing an alliance against enemies that existed beyond the edge of known reality. Ambassador, Elena said gently, your species has a choice. You can remain as you are, cold and logical and safe, and wait for the Devourers to arrive. Or you can allow us to help you remember what it feels like to hope. The Vorthan delegate closed his eyes, accessing genetic memories that his species had suppressed for 3 millennia. For a brief moment, he remembered what his ancestors had been like before they chose efficiency over wonder. If we agree, he said quietly, if we allow you to help us change, what guarantee do we have that you won't become the very monsters you're claiming to protect us from? Chen smiled. And for the first time since entering the chamber, Kethron saw something in her expression that was unmistakably, recognizably human. None whatsoever, she admitted. That's what makes us different from the old Confederation. We're choosing to trust each other despite the risks, because the alternative is choosing fear over hope. The universe is vast and dangerous, Elena added. It contains wonders beyond imagination and terrors beyond description, but it also contains the possibility of becoming something greater than the sum of our fears. "Join us," Vrexta said, extending his transformed appendages toward the other delegates. "Help us build something worthy of survival." One by one, the delegates reached across the impossible table, joining hands and claws and tentacles in a gesture that would have been unthinkable before humanity's forced evolution. Outside the station's windows, human ships moved through space like schools of luminous fish, heading toward distant galaxies where they would scout for devourer activity and search for survivor civilizations to offer alliance. The galaxy had tried to erase humanity and had instead created something that refused to let any species face extinction alone. In the end, that was perhaps the most human thing of all: the stubborn refusal to let anyone suffer in isolation, even former enemies who had once voted for their destruction. The war was over. The real work was just beginning. And somewhere in the space between stars, ancient hungers stirred as they detected the first whispers of organized resistance from a galaxy that should have been helpless prey. The devourers were coming, but this time they would find prey that had become predators, victims that had become protectors, and a collection of species that had learned to choose evolution over extinction. This time, the monsters in the dark would discover what it meant to be afraid.